So, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. And we are continuing today to read Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. We're reading Volume 1, which is called Thinking. And Volume 1 has a number of parts to it, namely 4 parts. And the first part is called Appearance. And we are going to finish up that discussion of part 1 of volume 1 on appearance today. So we're reading chapters 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 6 is the thinking ego and the self, Kant. Chapter 7 is reality and the thinking ego, the Cartesian doubt and sensus communis. And then chapter 8 is on science and common sense, and returning to Kant's distinction between intellect and reason, truth and meaning. And it's not an accident that this first chapter in the book Thinking, which is on appearance, ends with chapter 8, which is on truth versus meaning. That is really the theme here of what Arendt is after. She says that the whole book on thinking is an attempt to understand the activity of thinking. What is this activity of thinking? Well, she says it's not necessarily a philosophical question. It is a question about what is thinking. What are we doing when we think? And she says that the guiding thread, according to which she will pursue this question, is the distinction between intellect and reason. In Kant's terminology, Verstand, understanding or intellect, and Vernunft, reason. And whereas intellect or cognition or Verstand seeks to know things and get the truth of them, reason or Vernunft or thinking doesn't pursue truth, it pursues meaning. And she says the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And this is really the claim that she makes, that you most have to try and understand if you're going to make sense of the whole book, and certainly this first part of the book, which is setting it up. So with that in mind, I think we should somewhat jump right in, just to remind ourselves that the chapter 5, which was the last chapter we read for last time, was on appearance and semblance, and she begins to develop this idea of authentic and inauthentic semblances, which is going to be an interesting and important idea that she carries through in chapters 6 and 7. But the basic idea is that there are semblances, namely things that are not real, that even though they're not real, are part of what it means to be human, and that they are not, therefore, semblances that can simply be disproven and excised from human thinking. We actually have to deal with them. She says in chapter 5, authentic semblances are unavoidable and inherent in the world of appearances. And this is a great argument against scientific positivism, right? So there are certain semblances which, even though they're not scientifically provable and they're not real, they are inherent and important in the world of appearances. So now as we move to chapter 6, Thinking, Ego, and the Self, Kant, she says that when Kant develops his idea of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, and so for those of you who don't know your Immanuel Kant, Kant says that the only things human beings can know are objects of experience, namely things we experience in our heads, through intuition, through senses. We can't know anything in itself. So when I see you, looking at me through the computer, I don't see you in yourself. I see an appearance of you. I see an intuition of you, and it's an object of experience, and that's all I can know. I can't know what's behind the object of appearance. I can only know that it's there. And Kant says that there are there's appearances and objects in themselves, and he then calls appearances mere appearances, which Arendt says she says there's no problem with the distinction between thing in itself and appearance. The problem is when you say mere appearance, you create this hierarchy in which the thing in itself is more true or more important than the appearance. And as you know from reading about Portman's work and her use of Adolf Portman's work, she wants to reverse or at least challenge this hierarchy that puts being over appearance. And she wants to say, actually, it may be that appearance is more important than being. So Kant actually thinks of and first discovers the thing in itself, being, as opposed to appearance, in the experience of thinking. So this is relevant to our inquiry into what is the activity of thinking. Kant says that in the experience of thinking, in the activity of thinking, I think. And in thinking, I am conscious of myself. Now, you all know that René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, or I think I am. Kant doesn't say exactly the same thing. He says, I think, and I'm conscious of myself. And in this consciousness of myself, in this sheer activity of thinking, what I am is the thing itself. Although I never see that thing itself, or actually touch it, or feel it in any sensible way. But I think about it, and I think I am a self, and I think there must be some self behind myself. There must be something there. And the thoughts I have when I'm thinking can't just come out of nowhere. That can't be arbitrary, I think. They must come from my thinking ego, my thing, it's myself. And this thinking ego must be something. And so he says, even though we can't sense this thinking ego, even though it's invisible and non-sensible, we have a non-sensible feeling that it exists. Now that's a mouthful to some degree, but this is an important idea in Kant, and it comes up in a lot of his work, non-sensible feelings, especially in his moral and political philosophy, when he'll say that freedom is a non-sensible feeling as well. In any case, Kant says that we have this non-sensible feeling that I have a thinking ego. And this thinking ego is not the same as myself that exists in the apparent world. It's the source of my thinking. It's the Ding an sich. And so this creates a metaphysical fallacy that Kant himself recognized. The fallacy is simple. It's that, on the one hand, I'm aware that I have this non-sensible thinking ego, and yet I'm also aware that this non-sensible thinking ego, I can't ever prove that it exists. It's a logical fallacy. And she says the Oxford philosophers, by which she means the analytic philosophers, will say, oh, all these metaphysical thinkers like Kant and Hegel were so stupid. They didn't understand it was a logical fallacy. She says, no, they understood it. But what they understood also is that this thinking ego, even though it can't be proven, and even though it's not real in the sense that we can know it, is what she calls an authentic semblance. It's caused by, as I said before, the inherent paradoxes of human living as an appearing and thinking being. On the one hand, we appear, but on the other hand, we have this experience of thinking. And in thinking, we withdraw from the world. And in withdrawing from the world, we imagine ourselves, we feel that we have a thinking ego. And everyone has this feeling, she says. It's not just me. All of you have it. And insofar as we all have this feeling of ourselves as a thinking ego, it is authentic. It is an inherent paradox of being a human being and living in a world. Chapter 7 is reality and the thinking ego, the Cartesian doubt and the sensus communis. Sensus communis is this common sense, which she's going to call the sixth sense. So we have our five senses that we all know of. And she says the common sense is what fits them all together. And it's what fits us into the apparent world. It's the sense we all have in common. So the problem is that, again, there's this paradox in which all of us not only have common sense and not only exist in the apparent world, but also know how to think. And insofar as we know how to think, we know how to withdraw from that world of appearances and imagine ourselves as a thinking ego, separate from that world of experiences, a disembodied, purely thinking being. Now, philosophers maybe do this better or more often, more perceptively or strongly than some of us do, but all of us can have this sense of a thinking ego. And the thinking ego makes us doubt the common world. It's part of what she calls a solipsism, a solipsistic theory that sees man as singular. And she says all philosophers and all people, insofar as they are thinking, in the activity of thinking, see man as this thinking being, in Descartes' language, a pure mind, separate from body. So Descartes creates this dualism, that on the one hand there's thinking, and on the other hand there's body. And he says they're separate, and his question is, how do they interact? Well, even if we don't accept pure Cartesian dualism, the question is, we all have this sense of us as a thinking being, which doesn't exist, Arendt says. It's a fictitious idea, because there is no disembodied mind or thinking being. It's an semblance, as we've said. It withdraws from what she calls the beastliness of the multitude into the absolute solitude of the one, on page 47. And Descartes is the example of this truly radical solipsism. And she says it's a response to the glories of science. And it's important for us to at least understand what she means by this, because this is part of her approach to science, which is going to continue to come up over and again during the book. What science does, insofar as science is a kind of thinking, is it challenges what we know. It challenges the appearance. It looks, so we see the sun rise, and science says, is that really what's happening? Or is it the sun is there and we're moving around the sun on the earth? So science leads to doubt. And it is out of this glory of science, which teaches us that we can pierce common sense and show it to be an illusion, an semblance, or an appearance, and therefore seek to disillusion ourselves. It is this glory of science that leads us to reject appearances and reject common sense, and thus the apparent world. So she cites Wittgenstein on page 49, who is the ultimate solipsistic thinker at one point, and she says that at death the world does not alter, but comes to an end. That's a fundamental claim of solipsism, namely that when I die, the world doesn't continue after me, simply altered, namely without me as a living being. The world ends, because everything in the world is part of my thinking ego. And that's the fallacy of the thinking ego. And Arendt says there is no such thing. But, namely, she says, this thinking ego is still a meaningful and authentic semblance. So, chapter 8 is called Science and Common Sense, Kant's distinction between intellect and reason, truth and meaning. So just to remind ourselves of the arc, the overarching question of the book is what is the activity of thinking? And she wants to argue that the activity of thinking is not about the pursuit of truth, but is about the pursuit of meaning. It's thus not about cognition or the intellect. It's about the reasonable pursuit of meaning. So, at the end of chapter 7, she's talking about this feeling of thinking and this feeling of reality. And she says, thinking cannot destroy the feeling of reality, but it can suspend it. So we all have a sense of thinking. We also have a sense of that we live in a real world. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like this book is real, and the table I'm sitting at is real, and thank God the chair I'm sitting on is real, or I would be falling. And there's this feeling that I live in a real world. And as much as Descartes says that we are thinking beings and we are rational beings, and that there's a separation of my thinking and my body, what Arendt says is we all have this feeling of being placed in reality. And the common sense is the sixth sense that sort of is responsible for uniting all of our other five senses and giving us this feeling of reality. Thinking can destroy that feeling. I mean, cannot destroy that feeling, she says, but it can suspend it temporarily. The great story that all philosophers tell about this, including Arendt, I should say there's a great book by Jacques Tominot, who just died last month, one of the great philosophers of our time and one of the great readers of Hannah Arendt. We have a nice eulogy we put up on our website about a month ago if you're interested. But Jacques Tominot wrote a book on Hannah Arendt on the question of the Thracian maid. And the Thracian maid is the story told of a Thracian maid in Thrace, back in Greece, who's walking along and sees who is it? One of the Greek philosophers known for his great speculative thought. I'm blanking on his name. But she sees him walking along, and he's thinking about the stars, and he falls into a well. And she goes to him and says, you're so brilliant, and you're so thoughtful, but you can't even see what's in front of you, whereas I'm just a maid, but I don't fall into wells. This idea of this image of the philosopher who is so caught up in his mind and in his thought that he doesn't see what the world in front of him is this idea that Thales is the philosopher, and he's so caught up in the world of ideas that he doesn't see the world in front of him. And Arendt says you can't destroy the world, but someone like Thales can suspend it and withdraw from reality. And all thinkers do this, but true philosophers do it more than the rest of us. And so she starts chapter 8 and says, we see something very similar with science and the modern scientist. The end of science, she says, is a decision about what is worthwhile knowing. And a scientist wants to know, They want to know the truth. They want to know what is. And to a certain degree, you have to separate yourself from common sense in order to go behind common sense. And yet, even though that's the case, even though there's a way in which science, like philosophy, removes ourselves from the common sense world, science in the end wants to know the truth, and it seeks cognition. And that cognition is based on evidence, and that evidence is taken from the world of appearances. And those appearances can reveal what's true, but they can also conceal what's true. And every disillusion, and thus every new scientific truth, is a loss of one earlier truth and one earlier piece of evidence. But it's the acquisition of a new one. She cites Merleau-Ponty for this idea on page 54. So there is in science, on the one hand, a rejection of common sense, and on the other hand, an affirmation of common sense and an attempt to rethink common sense and bring about a new common sense. So Nancy, your question, just to go back to it, is, I'm perplexed by the ontological status of common sense, or this sixth sense. Well, common sense is this, it's not one of the five senses, right? Sight, sound, touch, smell. I'm going to miss one. Sight, sound, touch, smell. What else do we do? Hearing.
We hear you. We hear you.
Yeah.
We hear you.
Yeah. So it's not one of the five physical senses, but it's this non-physical sense that fits all those senses together and gives us our sense of reality. It's not like pure thought, because pure thought is a withdrawal from the world. It's not at all like that. It's in the world, and yet it's not a physical sense.